In part 1, I presented an overview of human genetics, and one point I repeated several times is that most people in most of their cells have 46 chromosomes because they have 23 chromosome pairs. However, there are exceptions to this. Let's start by considering an example of an individual with 47 chromosomes. So here you see the set of chromosomes, and we can see by looking at the sex chromosomes that this individual is male because there's one X and one Y chromosome present. But what's particularly distinctive here is that there are 3 copies of chromosome 21 instead of the usual 2 copies. With the 3 copies of chromosome 21, that's why they have 47 chromosomes overall. People with 3 copies of chromosome 21 have Down syndrome. Now, when a specific chromosome has 3 copies, it's often referred to as a trisomy, and that's why Down syndrome is often referred to as trisomy 21. Down syndrome appears to be one of the very rare examples where humans can have an extra copy of a chromosome and still survive. We seem to be pretty finely tuned to those 46 pairs of chromosomes and don't tolerate variation from that number very well, particularly in regard to the autosomes. Sometimes babies are born with an extra copy of chromosome 13, a condition referred to as Patau syndrome. Sometimes babies are born with an extra copy of chromosome 18, a condition referred to as Edwards syndrome. However, in the case of Patau syndrome and Edwards syndrome, the baby's health is so negatively impacted that tragically they are very unlikely to live past their first birthday. This is how one recent work on genetics describes the situation. Trisomies of autosomal chromosomes other than 21, 18, and 13 always result in early miscarriage and are, therefore, not found in infants or children. That's why you will not encounter people with an extra copy of chromosome number 1 or chromosome number 2 or chromosome number 3 or 4 or 5. Chromosome complements such as these are simply not compatible with human life. Down syndrome appears to be the exception where you can have an extra copy of an autosome and still live a long life. And part of this likely relates to the fact that chromosome 21 is the smallest autosome and has the least genes. Here's how one geneticist contrasts chromosome 1 with chromosome 21. The volumes, chromosomes, are not of equal size. Volume 1 is the largest, holding some 2,058 gene recipes. The smallest of the regular chromosomes, volume 21, carries just 234 gene recipes. So in this case here, he's referring to genes as recipes, which I guess is a useful analogy for what genes are. However, I want to focus more on the numbers. Notice he says that chromosome 1 holds about 2,058 genes. Now, if we remember that the human genome contains about 20,000 genes spread across one set of chromosomes, that means roughly 10% of our genes are found on chromosome number 1. However, if chromosome 21 only holds about 234 genes, that's roughly only over 1% of our genome. And so that's why we seem to be able to tolerate, humans can, that extra chromosome 21, but not any of the other chromosomes. One of the things we're going to find is when we study the genome, again and again, a common theme that comes up is that dosage of genes and chromosomes is important. You don't want too many genes and chromosomes, but you don't want too little. Dosage is really important. Well, now that we've considered the autosomes, let's look at the sex chromosomes, because they're the ones that are really important with the discussion at hand. And at first inspection, things are a little bit more confusing here because humans seem to tolerate a lot more variation in their sex chromosomes than they do in their autosomes. So let's start by considering this set of chromosomes here. This is actually from an individual with 45 chromosomes, and you'll notice that they only have one sex chromosome. They only have one X chromosome. So some individuals are born with 45 chromosomes, including one X chromosome. Some individuals have 47 chromosomes, including 3 X chromosomes. Some individuals have 47 chromosomes, including 2 X and 1 Y chromosome. Some individuals have 47 chromosomes, including 1 X and 2 Y chromosomes. And some individuals have 48 chromosomes, including 2 X and 2 Y chromosomes. So how do we make sense of all of this? Well, first of all, let's start by going through these 5 examples by deciphering who of them is male and who are female. And to do this, we're going to go back to a quote we learnt in part 1. Remember how James Watson, the Nobel Prize winning discoverer of the structure of DNA, said, "The possessor of a Y is male." Now, remember, I also said at a later stage, I'm going to come back to this comment and add a few little caveats to it. But for the moment and for our current purposes, it is a pretty robust statement. The possessor of a Y is male. So let's consider these 5 examples. First of all, the example where someone had 45 chromosomes, including 1 X chromosome. So in this instance here, there's no Y present, so this individual is obviously female, and individuals with 45 chromosomes and 1 X chromosome are females with a condition known as Turner syndrome. How about the second example with 47 chromosomes? Well, in this instance here, there's 3 X chromosomes, and once again, no Y is present, so this individual is female. And individuals with 3 X chromosomes have what's referred to as triple X syndrome or trisomy X. So they are most certainly female. Okay, now how about the next example where we had an individual with 47 chromosomes, including 2 X and 1 Y chromosome. Now you might look at that one and think, well, hang on a second, there's 2 X chromosomes there, but remember, the possessor of a Y is male. So, and the Y chromosome has the genetic instructions to trigger male development. So individuals with 47 chromosomes, including 2 X and 1 Y, are most certainly males, and they have a condition referred to as Klinefelter syndrome. The next example, this one probably isn't, no prizes for guessing this one because 2 Y chromosomes are present, 47 chromosomes XYY. This individual is obviously male, and no prizes for guessing that one. And how about the next one again? 48 chromosomes XXYY. Once again, the principle that the possessor of a Y is male applies here, and this individual is male too. So let's now have a look at the incidence. How likely do these occur? Well, first of all, we see that in the case of Down syndrome, that occurs in about 1 out of 700 to 1 out of 1100 live births. Turner syndrome is less common. That occurs in about 1 out of 2,500 to 1 out of 5,000 live female births. Triple X syndrome occurs in about 1 out of 1,000 live female births. And that's about as common as Klinefelter syndrome and Jacob syndrome, which occur in about 1 out of 1,000 live male births. And finally, we see XXYY syndrome, which is much rarer and occurs in about 1 out of 18,000 to 1 out of 40,000 live male births. So we've seen the incidence of how commonly these occur, but I'm sure you still have lots of questions. For one thing, why is it that humans are so finely tuned to our autosomes and can barely tolerate any variation, but when it comes to our sex chromosomes, there seems to be all these extra X and Y chromosomes and it doesn't seem to be such a problem? And even if we just focus on the X chromosome specifically, if you think about the X chromosome, we learn in part 1 that it has about 8 to 900 genes. And we know that those genes are really important. And so the X chromosome is over 3 times larger. Well, it has more than 3 times the amount of genes that chromosome 21 does. And yet, there doesn't seem to be much of a problem having extra or less X chromosomes. And even if we consider the most usual scenario where we think of most females have 2 X chromosomes and most males have 1 X chromosome, well, if dosage is so important, why is it that females can have twice as many X chromosomes as males, and it doesn't seem to be a problem for either sex. Well, there's an important biological phenomenon that occurs in our cells that goes a long way to explaining this conundrum. And I cannot overemphasize how important this biological phenomenon is. What I'm referring to here is X chromosome inactivation. Now, as the name suggests, X chromosome inactivation involves the inactivation or shutting down of X chromosomes. The way this happens is that the genome produces a long RNA molecule that binds to this extra X chromosome. It recruits other proteins and they work together to condense and effectively shut down the X chromosome. Now, the chromosome isn't shut down in its entirety, but for the most part, there are some genes that are still active, but for the most part, it is shut down. And shut down X chromosomes are referred to as bar bodies. This is how an important work on chromosomes describes the situation. In both male and female, one and only one completely functioning X chromosome is needed. X chromosomes in excess of 1 are inactivated as the normal 46XX female exemplifies. So there's your answer. You need an X chromosome, but you only need one. And that's why most females who have 2 X chromosomes will shut down one of the X chromosomes in each of their cells. Now, I like the way the geneticist Nessa Carey describes how this process of X chromosome inactivation occurs very early on in female development. She describes it this way. Very early in development, after just a few rounds of cell division, one X chromosome is inactivated in each cell of the embryo. Sometimes it's the X that came from father, sometimes the X that came from mother. Every daughter cell that subsequently develops switches off the same X chromosome as its parental cell. This means that of the 50 trillion or so cells in the adult female body, on average about half will express the X chromosome that was provided by the egg, and the other half will express the X chromosome that was provided by the sperm. So you see, in one sense, most females are mosaics because they've shut down the X chromosome they receive from their father in half of their cells, and in the other half, roughly, they shut down the X chromosome they receive from their mother. But why is this process of X chromosome inactivation important when we consider variations in sex chromosomes? Well, let's go through these 3 different scenarios of females with different numbers of X chromosomes. We've got females with Turner syndrome who have 1 X chromosome. We've got females with 2 X chromosomes, by far the most common scenario, and then we have females with 3 X chromosomes. Well, first of all, females with Turner syndrome, they only have 1 X chromosome. They are not going to shut that X chromosome down. And as we've learned already, females with 2 X chromosomes, they shut down that extra X chromosome. And when we come to females with 3 X chromosomes, they will actually, in fact, shut down 2 of those, leaving them only 1 fully functioning X chromosome. So even though on first inspection, these 3 different examples of females with different numbers of X chromosomes look quite different, when we take X chromosome inactivation into account, it goes a long way to explaining how do we cope with this variation in the number of sex chromosomes. Well, what about now, let's consider the examples of males with Klinefelter syndrome. Remember how some males have XXY. They have 3 sex chromosomes, 2X and 1Y. They're most certainly males. Does X chromosome inactivation occur here too? Well, Nessa Carey addresses that as well when she writes this. Male cells contain an X and a Y chromosome, and they never inactivate the single X. But sometimes males are born who have 2 X chromosomes and 1 Y. They are still males because it's the Y chromosome that drives masculinization, but their cells inactivate the extra X just as female cells do. So you see, X chromosome inactivation actually applies to Klinefelter males as well. So let's now have a look at those few examples of variation in sex chromosomes amongst males and take X chromosome inactivation into account here too and see what difference that makes. So first of all, we have most males who have one X and one Y. Well, they're not going to shut down that X. They need that X chromosome. Then we consider Klinefelter males, XXY, and as we've just learned, they will shut down that extra X chromosome. Then in the next example, we have men with Jacob syndrome, where it's XYY. Now, Y chromosomes don't get shut down. However, it doesn't seem to be as much of a problem because remember, the Y chromosome is pretty small. It might have more DNA letters than chromosome 21, but it actually has less genes. So having an extra Y chromosome doesn't seem to be such a problem as you might think. And so that's that one. Obviously, they're not going to shut down their X chromosome. Then we come along to XXYY syndrome. Well, in this case here too, one of those extra X chromosomes will get shut down. So you see, when we take X chromosome inactivation into account, it goes a long way to explaining this dosage conundrum that humans can have all this variation of sex chromosomes in terms of the X chromosome, but the extra ones are shut down. So I want to quote an important work now that sort of summarizes this, brings it all together, how we consider all these variations in sex chromosomes in light of sex chromosome inactivation. And I quote, "Sex chromosome imbalances need to be considered separately. Any X chromosomes in excess of 1 are genetically inactivated, thus indicating the inactivated X in lowercase." Now remember that. Look for the inactivated lowercase X chromosomes as we go through the rest of this quote. Normal females are 46XX, normal males are 46XY, Turner females are 45X, Klinefelter males are 47XXY, and other X aneuploidies. Now, an aneuploidy is just a variation in chromosome number, either more or less. So we'll go back to this quote. And other X aneuploidies are 47XXX, 48XXXX, 48XXYY, 49XXXXY, 49XXXXX. Okay, now we're getting into really rare territory. Individuals with 5 X chromosomes getting 4 shut down. Well, even in these instances, though, you can see that X chromosome inactivation applies here too. But one of the things I want you to keep in mind, though, I don't want to give you the false impression that having extra X chromosome is no problem at all because it gets shut down. Remember, it doesn't get shut down in its entirety. There are still some genes that are active. So people who have variations in the number of X chromosomes will still experience health and developmental challenges. However, X chromosome inactivation does go a long way to explaining this dilemma of how we can handle so much variation in our X chromosome number. But one thing I want you to keep in mind is you do not need to get bamboozled by all these extra X chromosomes. The reason you don't need to get bamboozled is because your cells are not getting bamboozled. They're keeping a track of it and shutting down any extra X chromosomes. As Nessa Carey correctly points out, one of the oddest things we have come to realize is that our cells can count the number of X chromosomes. Not only can they count the number of X chromosomes that we have, they're shutting down all the extra ones. Well, to finish this section, I want to make another point to make people aware that these variations in sex chromosomes, the number of them, is not something new. It's something that has afflicted humans throughout human history. Now, early in 2024, the leading science journal Nature published a very interesting article with the following title: DNA yields earliest known case of sex development disorder. Now, in this article, they summarized some research from ancient DNA studies where they've found instances where people who lived thousands of years ago had Down syndrome and Turner syndrome. They also document cases where throughout history, men have been discovered who had Klinefelter syndrome, and also an instance of a gentleman in the medieval period who had Jacob's syndrome. And the way that they did this is by amplifying fragmentary DNA. They've been able to, by looking at the ratios, go, oh, hang on a second, this person must have had an extra copy of chromosome 21, that sort of thing. That's how they've deciphered that people had these variations in their chromosome number. And so, yeah, I just want to make the point that these are nothing new. They've afflicted humans throughout human history. However, one of the advantages of today is because we have a greater knowledge of these conditions, things like Turner syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome, and because of growing knowledge in fields like endocrinology, hormones, and so on. For instance, females born today with Turner syndrome can benefit from being given extra estrogen. Likewise, males born today with Klinefelter syndrome can benefit from being given extra testosterone. And so that's one benefit people living today have that obviously who lived with these conditions thousands of years ago wasn't available to them. So there's obviously been a lot of emphasis in this section on the X chromosome, but I want to turn my attention back now in the next section to the Y chromosome because I want to have a closer look at the results of my own Y chromosome test.